Good morning, everyone. I'm Alice Cite, the Director of Special Projects and Institutional Planning here at the Huntington, and it's my privilege to work under President Karen Lawrence, who's here with us this morning. I'm delighted today to welcome you to the Huntington on behalf of the symposium organizing team. Cian Leong Adams, Michelle Bailey, Philip Bloom, Yinshi Lermonton, Robert Horry, and Wei Yang. We are grateful for generous support from the Sammy Yuquan Lee Foundation and the Justin Vanya Memorial Fund for Educational Programs in the Chinese Garden. This symposium has been over 2 years in the making, and we're humbled by the immense attention received by this conference, which we think is one of the largest ever hosted here at the Huntington. This is due in large part to the amazing speakers who've agreed to participate, but even beyond that, it reflects the deep resonance that this topic has both in the broader cultural discourse and personally to many of us. Our introductory remarks today are being given by Simon K.C. Lee. We'll begin with panel 1 immediately after Simon's remarks, so speakers be at the ready, please. While Simon's CV is vast, my time is short, so let me just say, a journalist by training, Simon Lee was vice chairman of the International Press Institute and on the board of directors of Cite Climate News, which won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. He spent 23 years at the Los Angeles Times before retiring in 2007 as the assistant managing editor. He had also been the Times foreign editor, promoted for his work directing coverage of the Gulf War. Simon has been a longtime friend of the Huntington, a member of our Board of Governors since 2010, and since 2019, one of our 7 members on the Board of Trustees. Simon, we are honored to have you open our symposium. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Huntington, and thank you for your interest in today's symposium. Let me start with a personal perspective on why I believe the topic today is important. When I woke on January the 22nd, Sunday, my first thoughts were of Chinese New Year and of celebrations when I was a child in Hong Kong. And I turned on the television, and in an instant, those thoughts evaporated. The urgent top story of the news that day, as you all know, was of a mass shooting in Monterey Park the night before. So instantly, my thoughts were of dread. A mass killer motivated by anti-Asian hate was on the loose. It was a reaction, I'm guessing, shared by many, possibly most, Asians in California. It didn't occur to me at the time that the gunman might have been Asian. It's reverse racism, I know, to assume that your own are incapable of such evil. By early afternoon that Sunday, I knew better. The killer was Chinese, and the next day, another mass shooting in Half Moon Bay reinforced the point. Still, it's a reality. Asians in America live with a sense of vulnerability. It's not difficult to see the basis for that. The sharp rise in the incidence of anti-Asian racism and hate speech, and most horrifically, violence. For instance, the death of an Asian woman pushed under an oncoming subway train to her death, another bludgeoned fatally while sweeping her sidewalk in Queens. The last president is often blamed for fueling the increase in anti-Asian racism by pointedly connecting COVID to China. But challenges in so many spheres, from China and with China and its communist dictatorship, Taiwan, human rights, trade and intellectual property disputes, even balloons, to cite just a few, also feed the flames of anti-Asian animus in our own country. Here at the Huntington, such trends prompted discussion about programming that could deepen the understanding of Asian American history and contemporary experience, and enrich dialogues about race, ethnicity, and immigration. Today's symposium is just one example of the institution's strong commitment to advance that goal. Its extensive collections of Asian American, and Pacific Rim materials, particularly in the history of Asians in California and Los Angeles, can help scholars do the same. It has Asian curators in all three of its collection areas: the library, the art museum, and the botanical gardens. Still, the institution recognizes there's much more work to be done before its collections better represent the breadth and variety of the Asian diaspora in America. In the last several decades, the Huntington has responded to the changing demographics of San Gabriel Valley neighbors and ramped up its attention to Asian communities. It recognizes its debt to Chinese, whose labors helped to build the railroad fortune that enabled its foundation, and the Japanese Americans who built what was originally called the Oriental Garden and is now the Japanese Garden. Its Chinese garden, built for more than $63 million, most of it donated, has become one of its most popular attractions. About 200,000 of its annual visitorship self-identify as Asian or part Asian, an increase of roughly 50% since the mid-90s. They are also attracted by rich related programming, previous symposia and lectures, interviews with Asian talents such as the best-selling novelist Charles Yu and the award-winning architect Billy Chen, exhibitions about the garden's calligraphy, and now ongoing about its construction. Also an opera on Gold Mountain about a Chinese pioneering immigrant family. The Japanese garden was renovated in 2011 to mark its centennial, and the next year a ceremonial tea house was installed. This fall, a major new attraction will be opened, providing opportunities for visitors to learn more about and share many aspects of Japanese culture. Even the institution's governance has changed. Today, 2 of its 7 trustees are Chinese Americans. The experts of our symposium have been challenged to remind and educate us about the history of the Asian experience in America, to explore the trials and triumphs of the Asian community that have brought it to today, and to assess what that situation is. Finally, perhaps the biggest challenge, to suggest ways forward to make that a better position tomorrow. The symposium's focus on Asians in California reflects both the past and the present. It was here that the Asian story in America began, and now it is the state with the most Asians. The first Chinese in any numbers came in the mid-19th century, drawn to the possibility of a better life by the word of the gold rush of '49. And it was here that Japanese came a little more than a decade later with the same dreams and found work mostly in agriculture. The Chinese found their labor in demand, but their humanity mostly denied. Instead of fortune, they found the promise of Gold Mountain illusory. And for the Japanese, wartime internment denied their patriotism, their rights, and in most cases, deprived them of their property. Our first panel this morning will examine roughly the first 120 years of that history, how Asians managed to put down roots in the barren soil of racism, finding ways around the barriers thrown up by both mob, such as the Los Angeles Chinatown massacre of 1871, and government laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, barring Chinese laborers from immigrating, and California's series of alien land laws in the early 20th century restricting Asian ownership of land. The second panel, after a lunch break, will discuss the developments of America's Asian populations, note the plural, since the mid-60s to the present. The post-war reversal of many of the laws and immigration policies explicitly aimed at Asians opened the way to many changes. The almost half-century since has seen the creation of new Asian communities and the flourishing of Asian talents and creativity to our society. Inevitably, there have been contentious issues, among them the long-running controversy about race-conscious university admissions policies and the chimera of the model minority, superficially a phrase of admiration that is so generalized that it impedes understanding and advances alienation. My wife, June, and I, newcomers to the state in 1984, have witnessed many of those changes. I'll offer two examples, one negative and one positive. By the time of our arrival, the growth of Asian populations in the San Gabriel Valley and its cities, and resistance to it, was well underway. I remember it had evolved at that time into a fierce battle over the issue of language used in store signage. But that fight was a proxy for the resistance, part of whose true nature was exposed in one case by a bumper sticker urging, "Will the last American to leave Monterey Park bring the flag with them?" On the plus side, also underway, was a 3-year-old foundation of the Asian American Journalists Association. Founded in 1981 by 7 LA area journalists of Asian descent. The AAJA's purpose was to remedy the shortage of Asian journalists nationwide in hopes that more Asian viewpoints would improve coverage of the Asian communities and even of Asian issues globally. Other goals were to help develop the skills of young journalists of Asian descent and to help raise Asians to the top leadership positions directing media. AAJA has succeeded very well in the first 2 goals. Today it has more than 1,600 members, 19 US chapters, and 1 in Asia, and has seen the enormous growth in Asians in the newsrooms. In the wake of the January mass shootings, many Asian voices in news and commentary were evident, contributing to wide-ranging, sensitive coverage of ethnic, socio-economic differences and nuances among Asian communities. Sadly, there's been no discernible success in Asians reaching the very top roles. Nonetheless, the idea of AAJ might have been one small part of a discussion had a panel back then been given the challenge that this symposium poses to the experts on today's 3rd panel, to consider the future of Asian America and how the lessons of its past might show it ways towards a more equitable place in our society. We hope you in the audience today will participate actively, especially in this final panel. Ask questions, make suggestions, join the debate, and enrich the discussion. I'll get a head start on that, though I make no claim to enrichment. Here are a couple of issues, one much debated and one perhaps less so, that I hope we hear addressed as we consider ways to advance the Asian American cause. The first is about the desirability of the very term Asian American. Does it do a disservice in obscuring the wide diversity among the many Asians of different origins? Do we lose knowledge and complexity that would otherwise foster greater understanding? The Chinese American author and activist Helen Zia, whom I respect, argues that the encompassing label is much more useful. In 1992, she has said, the terms American, Chinese American, and Japanese American were much more commonly used. The distinction didn't save Vincent Chin, a Chinese American beaten to death in Detroit that year by two baseball bat-wielding auto workers, whites, angry about the popularity of Japanese cars. In the recent rise in acts of hate, Zia has said, if you're Asian, you're a target. Every different ethnicity of Asian Americans has suffered the hate incidents that are going on today. She argues, in effect, that if we are all vulnerable, no matter who we are, then our fight is more powerfully waged under one banner. The other issue is about the role of representation in helping minority communities. It's a common complaint, right? We don't see enough faces like ours in, well, you name it. The movies, on television, in government, in politics, in the news. If we had more public presence, the implication is, there would be less discrimination, less racism. Well, I think I'm seeing plenty of representation of both Asian Americans and non-American Asians making their name in the US. To offer just two examples of such visibility, which are plentiful. In politics, we have Asian or part Asian senators from Illinois and Hawaii. We have mayors in Boston, Cincinnati, Oakland, and Seattle. And admittedly, a very faint possibility, an Asian vice president and an Asian Republican, both women, vying for the presidency. In movies, a film with an impossible title about an Asian American family, made mostly by Asians, winning plaudits everywhere almost all the time, including 11 Oscar nominations, now supported by the coincidental, I think not, re-release of a 22-year-old Asian film with a long title that once drew 10 nominations. Will recognition come 8 days from now? There was already an Asian Best Picture Oscar in 2019, the Korean film Parasite. And last fall, a newly minted quarter coin honoring an Asian movie trailblazer who made her mark decades before even my long-ago birth, Anna May Wong. I won't belabor the point, but do Asian talents and celebrity really redound to the normalization of Asian communities? Does American society credit its Asian communities as a prolific source of contributions in the arts, letters, music, science, industry, and technology? In a wider sense, I think what we ask of our panelists today is first, to review through an Asian lens history's answers to questions that all minorities have pondered since the founding of the United States, and then to suggest new answers going forward for Asians of California and the nation. The questions are these. What does it mean to be American? Who has the right to wear that title and to share fully in the promise it implies? We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to welcome everyone to the Huntington on the occasion of Panel 1 in the Asian American Experiences in California Symposium. My name is Wei Yang, and I'm curator of Pacific Rim Collections in the Huntington's Library Division. As the moderator for this panel, we'll focus on the roots of Asian experience and anti-Asian racism in California. Given the historical focus of this panel, our speakers will deliver a 15 to 20-minute presentation, some of which will be grounded on the Huntington's collections across the library, art museum, and botanical gardens. After the presentations, we will have a moderated conversation with the panelists, followed by a Q&A session with you in the audience. Our first speaker is Gordon H. Chen. Gordon Chen is Professor of History at Stanford University and the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities. He recently stepped down as the Senior Associate Vice Provost for undergraduate education. In that position, he helped lead the university through the trials of the pandemic. He has been on the Stanford faculty since 1991. In 2019, he published Ghosts of Gold Mountain, the epic history of the Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad, and as co-editor, The Chinese and the Iron Road, Building the Transcontinental Railroad. These books draw more than 7 years of work conducted by the Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project at Stanford, which he has co-directed. Additionally, he edited or co-edited Asian Americans in Politics, Chinese American Voices with Judy Young and Him-Mark Lai, and Asian American Art, A History. He's a fourth-generation Californian, having grown up in Oakland, California. We're excited that Gordon Chen will be in residence as a fellow at the Huntington next year. His paper title today is Beyond Promontory, Chinese Railroad Workers and the Rise of California. Our second speaker is Naomi Hirahara. Naomi Hirahara is the Edgar Award-winning writer of the Mas Arai mysteries and nonfiction history books for both adults and children. Clark and Division, her first historical mystery and Mary Higgins Clark Award winner, is set in 1944 Chicago and follows a Los Angeles family's release from wartime detention in Manzanar. Her sequel, Evergreen, which will be released this August, will center on the family's return to Los Angeles, specifically in locations such as Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, Little Tokyo, and Burbank. A former editor of the Rafu Shinpo newspaper, she is part of the original team who developed the exhibition at the visitor centers at Manzanar National Historic Sites. She's currently at work researching Japanese immigrant creative workers in Pasadena in the early 1900s for a new historical mystery called Crown City. The title of the paper, Torii Gates Welcoming Empire, Japanese Immigrants and the Nisei Cultural Workers in Pasadena Landscape and Life. Our third speaker is Jing-Chen Ho. Jing-Chen Ho is the author of Fiona and Jane, named one of the best books in 2022 by NPR, Time Magazine, Vulture, Vogue, and Oprah Daily. Her writing appears in New York Times Magazine, The Cuts, Electric Literature, Los Angeles Times, Georgia Review, and elsewhere. She's the 2023 Mary Rudd Endowed Chair of Creative Writing at Scripps College. She's also a doctoral candidate in literature and creative writing at the University of Southern California. She holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Her paper is Cite, Cite, and Cites, Racial Violence, Chinese Angelenos, and the Lost Stories of LA's Original Chinatown. And our first speaker is Marci Kwon. Marci Kwon is Assistant Professor of Art History at Stanford University and co-director of the Cantor Arts Center's Asian American Art Initiative. She's the author of Enchantments, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism, and co-editor of the online Martin Wong Catalog Raisonné. Her paper will focus on the early history of Asian American artists in California through the lens of the Cantor Arts Center's recent exhibition, East of the Pacific, Making Histories of Asian American Arts, curated by Elisa Pichamon Alexander. It will also discuss efforts by Stanford's Asian American Art Initiative and to recover and to preserve these complex history. In sum, I hope that you are excited as I am for today's lineup of presenters to speak to the historical context to the issues confronting Asian Americans today. And now let's give a warm welcome to all of our presenters and to our first speaker, Gordon Chen.
Thank you, Li Wei. Thank you, leadership of the Huntington Library and Gardens and this most lovely setting here. I last spoke here a few years ago. I think some of you in the audience attended that talk. I hope I have some new things to say to you today, but thank you so much. It's always a delight to be here. It's just an extraordinary site, and I feel very privileged to share some thoughts with you. I have a lot to share, and I have a time limit, so I'm going to be speaking quickly. The last time I spoke here, I spoke about the Chinese workers and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and today I'm asking the question, well, what happened to those workers after the building of the Transcontinental? So this is why it's called Beyond Promontory. Promontory is the Promontory Summit in Utah, where the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads met in May 10th, 1869 to finish the construction of the first transcontinental railroad. And that linked physically, metaphorically, economically, politically, militarily, the United States as a continental power. So it was a transformative event. Now, some of you might object. Some of you who are proponents of the story of Chinese America beginning with gold miners. But I contend that the substantive beginning of the Chinese experience in California and in the United States is actually with the railroad workers. They began to work on America's rail lines as early as the 1850s, and in the mid-1860s, we know about their epical effort on the first transcontinental railroad line. By the time the line was completed in May 1869, some 20,000 Chinese, the greatest collective workforce of any ethnicity to work in the American economy at that time, toiled to complete the western portion of that line. Now, for much of the time since then, they have been ignored, or they were even dishonored in American written history. Their work, their sacrifice, the trial of their experiences went largely unrecognized. Their efforts and then the loss of their history was emblematic of the general history of Chinese and other Asians in America, and many matters that Simon just addressed. Now, this famous photograph, I think it's probably the most famous photograph from the 19th century, although there might be a photograph of Abraham Lincoln that's more well known. But this photograph of the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, Utah, symbolizes this historical erasure. Where are the Chinese workers, even though they comprise 90% of the Western labor force on the Western portion? So I am not going to present that history that led up to this moment. I spoke about that history before, and I've published my work in this book, but I hope that many of you have seen it and will take a look. That book and the work of many other scholars in recent years have done much to retrieve that lost history. We now know much more about those 20,000 workers because of the wonderful work of writers and artists are giving personality and visual identity to them. I show you this image. This is not a recent painting, but a one. Since we're at an art museum, I have illustrations here from artwork, which I love to discuss. This was completed in 1881 and is at the California State Railroad Museum, but it is sort of symbolic of how the grand history of the railroad is presented to us and is carried down through history. And this is the way people think that the Promontory Summit looked in 1869, with Leland Stanford standing there in the middle and great assembled crowd at his feet, literally, and Chinese workers sort of off to the side, unnamed, but here at the feet of the great man, when in fact this never happened in history, but what really happened with the Chinese did lay the last rail, although Leland Stanford is given the credit of that. But because of the work of historians and hopefully maybe some of my friends and colleagues from the Southern California Chinese Historical Society and Museum and other writers are here in the audience, I thank you for your work. Thank you for others who've been interested in this history to now really challenge that great man history narrative that we see like in this painting. So other paintings we have now more recently from this artist, Miancitu, the powder monkey, as he calls it. I use it on the cover of my book here, The Ghost of Gold Mountain. Fascinating depiction of Chinese hanging down from the side of cliffs during the construction of the railroad. Other work he has here where he places the Chinese in the center of the frame. of his paintings and gives us actual visual image of what the Chinese look like. Now, what I'm going to ask today, as I said, what happened to these workers after they finished the work on the promontory? Were they simply dismissed from the work and abandoned to be on their own, as some contend? Now, in this talk, I want to introduce some of the history about post-promontory. Now, this is a grand history, as dramatic and important in many ways as the transcontinental story. And I will end by suggesting that even we who have been absorbed by the story of Chinese railroad workers are still missing a huge dimension of the story of the experience of Chinese railroad workers. That is, the importance, even centrality, of Chinese labor on railroads and the rise of the state of California itself. This story can open up our discussion about the place of other Asian Americans in California's rise as the most populous and economically important state in the country. So here is just some episodes that I'm going to raise that I hope will be of interest to you. Now, at the time that the Chinese completed the railroad, they were not completely dismissed or forgotten about or insulted. It actually, through history, they were displaced by other narratives. At the time that they completed the work, in fact, they were actually quite honored, as you can see from this paragraph from a long article published by the newly founded Scientific American. I'm not going to read it here because of time, but you can read it yourself. You can see it's actually, in essence, very, very praising of the Chinese and described in quite respectful ways the enormity of the work that the Chinese did. This was an indication of the impression that Chinese made on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. You can see them here in some of these photographs of the time, including even up in the High Sierra here with a snowstorm, probably rivaling the recent ones we've been having, if you try to imagine building railroads through the High Sierra with 30 or 40 foot snow drifts. Now, they were hailed to be good workers, to be exploitable labor source, but the point is that the general public acknowledged their work and respected their efforts. Now, even before this article was published, newspapers around the country reported on Chinese working on railroad lines in Oregon, in the Washington Territory. Hundreds of others were reported working on small, narrow gauge lines in Northern California, around the Lake Tahoe, Truckee, and Virginia City areas. Local newspapers around the country reported on the arrival of hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese to work on lines in Louisiana, Missouri, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Montana, Tennessee, Minnesota, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and even Long Island and New York. We discovered all these articles by newspapers, all around local newspapers that mentioned, we note the arrival of hundreds of Chinese to work on the rail, continue on the local lines. One of the most important of these post-promontory lines, at least for our discussion today, is the one that ran down the Central Valley to the greater Los Angeles basin where we are. The excellent work by researchers and other artists here have helped to uncover that, but so much more remains to be done. Now you can see these old maps here show some of the line here. I'm in Northern California, I can't interpret all of them, but you can probably make out the line that comes from the San Francisco Bay Area down the Central Valley and then hits the greater basin. Maybe someone can turn off their phone, please. And then hit the area over, this doesn't work, just north of the Los Angeles basin. Now, Promontory Summit was a big deal because of, I mentioned, the economic and social significance in uniting the country. Now, San Francisco, after its completion, was then only 6 days away from New York City, whereas as opposed to, saying, 3 to 6 months away from New York City before the Transcontinental Line was completed. Or 3 days, San Francisco was 3 days away from Chicago. But the time travel from San Francisco to Chicago at that time was about the same as it was between San Francisco and Los Angeles. So in physical space, Los Angeles was as far away as Chicago. The main route to get to San Francisco, to LA from San Francisco, which was by far the biggest city in California then, was by sea vessel. The terminus of the transcontinental line up in Sacramento was 450 miles away from Los Angeles. The Continental Railroad may have united the country, but not California itself. The railroad barons and the elite of California knew this, and they immediately thought of ways to create a railroad web within the state to develop its resources. LA in 1870 had a population of less than 6,000 in 1870, in a state of almost 600,000. But the business potential of the region was evident in the harbor at San Pedro and the fertile lands in the many valleys in the greater region. The challenge was to link these sites and with Northern California and the rest of the area east of California. The Central Pacific Railroad in the northern part of the state, the company, began to build south just a few months after the completion of the railroad in 1869. And then local developers here on the LA Basin began to build lines radiating out from central Los Angeles toward Anaheim, San Fernando, and San Bernardino. Chinese, we know, reported, lived right along the Los Angeles River as they were building these railroad lines up into the valleys. The railroad barons, the so-called Big Four, including Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, who was the uncle of Henry Huntington, the benefactor of this estate where we now meet, Mark Hopkins and Charles Crocker, rushed to build a line down the Central Valley into the lower San Joaquin. They employed thousands of Chinese, many were veterans of the transcontinental work. Others came directly from China after hearing about the need for railroad workers. They came from the Siyi or Sayup area, as most other Chinese in America did in those years. By late 1874, they reached Bakersfield. Other Chinese began to settle. Wherever the railroad went, Chinese went. That's why we had Chinese later on in Chicago, in Tucson, in the Redlands, Inland Empire. Now these workers, as described by the other workers on the transcontinental, were described as diligent, hardworking, and efficient. But they were not docile, as the stereotype has come. In March 1875, the entire Chinese workforce, several thousand who were encountering the tunneling work in the Tehachapis, struck for higher wages, just as they did in 1867 in Donner Summit. 3,000 workers struck for a week in Donner Summit. They took advantage of the monopoly they had on the labor, on the labor force to improve their conditions. They conducted other work stoppages to demand improvements in their work conditions over the following months. By late 1875, they reached the northern end of the Tehachapi Pass that separated the lower San Joaquin Valley from the Mojave, the rough boundary now between Kern and LA counties. The daily Alta Californian paper reported that 500 work animals and 2,500 men, Chinese, were now at the pass readying for the harsh winter. We can try to imagine what it was like to work there 100 years ago and 50 years ago. Some reports gave the number of Chinese workers at 3,000, not even 2,500. The grueling work they did was preparing the workbed, laying the track, and tunneling. As they encountered the Tehachapi Mountains, they faced rugged terrain that was as challenging as the High Sierra. One of the most famous of the construction feats was what we now know as the Tehachapi Loop at 4,000-foot elevation. Let me just ask you, I can sort of see, how many know about the Tehachapi Loop? Just raise your hands. So about 20%. All right. To overcome a sharp elevation, engineers devised a novel solution. They would have the line gradually loop around itself to go up the steep incline. It's been called one of the 7 engineering wonders of the world. This is a modern photo, clearly, but you can kind of see the long train of maybe 100 cars coming up the grade one direction and then looping around because of the steep incline and going virtually, literally over itself. Now, the most dramatic of this work, was the boring of the San Fernando Tunnel through the northern extension of the San Gabriels. It was necessary to link the San Gabriel Valley with the Santa Clara River area. Work began on that in March 1875, and ended more than a year later. About 1,500 Chinese worked on that bore. The work was torturous. A reporter from the LA Herald provided a dramatic eyewitness account of the work, and he called it the greatest construction project now in the United States at that time. He described the challenge. The earth, rather than solid rock, as the Donner Summit area, was of composite rock and sand, which had solidified. It had become as hard as concrete. Solid rock would have been easy to work with, he wrote, because the composite, although it was as hard as rock and required explosives to crack, also disintegrated because of the oil and water in the soil. So there were all constant cave-ins. Natural gas threatened explosions. The tunnel was also prone to disintegrate because of the trapped water, and it made it sort of a quicksand at times. The dark bore was dank, steaming, with constant danger of cave-ins. Workers toiled in the dark with only thousands of candles providing illumination. Sweat streamed from their bare bodies in the hot insides of the immense mountain. Many collapsed from the heat and exhaustion, he reported. Chinese worked in 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours a day they worked. Now, the journalists painted an almost hellish image of the work challenges. Well, one of these was to try to hasten the work by finding ways to build the tunnel on 8 faces at the same time. 8 faces. How do you build a tunnel with 8 faces at the same time? Well, I've posed this question to you. Oh, time is moving ahead. We can talk about this later on. 8 faces, they had to build shafts into the tunnel. Now, this are some of the historic photos of the tunnel. This was almost a mile and a half long that was constructed. Now, there are some artwork here you can see by Tyrus Wrong. Many of you know his name. He actually depicted some of these construction feats here. And this was the article about the driving of the last spike to completed the north-south line, which mentions Chinese right in the beginning of the paragraph, although Chinese were not included in the ceremony of the driving of the spike itself. Now, I wanted to just do 2 things to point up quickly here, is the building of the rise of California. You can see this is my kind of crude graphs here. You can see the rapid growth of California after the construction of the railroads, both the transcontinental and the north-south line, but then the decline of the Chinese after the railroads are built. So Chinese, I suggest here, were instrumental in the rapid rise of California, Los Angeles, because of these of their feats, but then expelled from the country or excluded from the country through the Exclusion Acts and the anti-Chinese movements, as we know all about. Now, I'm going to end because of this last story, which I think very, very few have ever heard about it. In 1878 and 79, a railroad company called the South Pacific Coast Railroad Company hired 1,000 Chinese in the Santa Cruz area to lay the track that would link Santa Cruz and San Jose. Veteran workers, Chinese workers, were among those. The company was headed by James G. Fair, who was the railroad baron of the Comstock silver mine boom in Nevada. And he hoped to become a railroad baron. We know him now because of the Fairmont Hotel, which carries his name. The line promised huge profits with its access into the dense forests of the Santa Cruz Mountains, that with its farming and fishing, and the mountains, though, proved to be a challenge. And you can still feel that challenge if you ever go on Highway 17 from San Jose over to Santa Cruz. And there, like down here, the mountains were saturated with oil and gas. In the spring of 1879, a tunnel explosion terribly burned more than a dozen Chinese workers in the tunnel. After surviving in agony for several weeks, 5 died at the Chinese hospital in San Francisco. Slowly, Chinese came back to work, fearful of other dangers. And then just before midnight on November 18th, 1879, a second disaster occurred 2,700 feet into the 1.25-mile-long tunnel when natural gas and seeping oil again exploded and took many more lives. 21 Chinese and 2 whites were in the tunnel at the time, And after 20 more Chinese entered the tunnel to try to aid the victims, another explosion happened that shook the mountain. And the tunnel acted as a giant cannon bore and blasted out fire, rock, equipment, and human flesh and bone. A third explosion occurred a moment later. Newspaper reports listed 24 Chinese killed inside the tunnel, 17 were removed, were all horribly burned, and many dying in agonizing pain. And the stench of burning flesh, quote unquote, belched from the portal. This is the newspaper on-site report. Would the scenes within the tunnel and about the entrance be faithfully pictured, it would send a shiver of horror through every reader of the Sentinel. The stench of burning flesh combined with the escaping gas is almost overpowering anywhere near the portal. The cabins are filled with mutilated Chinamen, some shrieking with the excruciating pain they are undergoing, others praying in their native tongue to their countrymen to kill them and put an end to their suffering, or beseeching the god of fire to have mercy upon them and cease his torments. In most of the cabins, tapers are burning, the perfume from which serves somewhat to temper the sickening odor of roasted flesh. One brutally injured man named Awa was found dead in his cabin with a silk scarf around his neck. His comrades said that he had hanged himself, but evidence suggested that his friends had strangled him to put him out of his misery. These are photos of the entrance to the tunnel, and you can see a Chinese here to the side. Now, the full number of Chinese who died in that incident is still not known. Local historians put the number total at 42 for every mile of track the Chinese built through the Santa Cruz Mountains. There is no marker to record those horrible tragedies. As we honor the work of those who came before us, of Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Southeast Asian ancestry, we must also mourn the hundreds of workers, Chinese workers here who died and whose names we will never know. How might we memorialize them? Thank you for your attention.
I should have asked for a step stool here. I think I'm going to have to do my usual, where I do the side podium thing, or else you won't see me at all. Huntington, I think you need to think about the podium. The Japanese American National Museum podium is very low. It's okay, it's all right. Okay, as you can see, this is the Rafu Shimpo, which is the Japanese American newspaper. This is a photo from their 90th anniversary. And I worked there as a reporter as well as an editor. And this photo was taken in 1993. So that is 30 years ago. The paper still exists, and it's, I guess, celebrating its 120th anniversary this year. And I'm seated in the front row, second from the left. So when I first started working there as a reporter, an activist was observing me. I was in my 20s, and saying, You don't seem like you're from the west side, Crenshaw. You don't seem like you're from the east side, Boyle Heights. Where are you from? And I'm from Pasadena. So what does it mean to be a Japanese American from Pasadena? Well, in terms of my lived experience, this is an elementary school that no longer exists in Altadena, part of the Pasadena public school system. It's taken in 1969, actually pretty integrated, right? I'm the one leaning towards my classmate, Eric. But the following year, due to a court-mandated federal order, Pasadena School District was desegregated. There was busing was instituted, and that was more geared towards its high schools, which was John Muir High Schools, which was that had more African Americans, and as well as Pasadena High School, which was more predominantly white. So this was actually my lived kind of Pasadena experience. But there was also another side, like my home experience, as well as the weekends. This photo is of my father, Sam Hirahara. He was a gardener, as many Japanese Americans. In fact, when I did this project for the Southern California Gardeners Federation, I learned that 1 out of 10 Japanese American men after World War II were gardeners. And why? It was easy entry. There were all these people being released from detention camps, and all you needed was a push mower and a broken down car, and you were in business. In my father's case, he's an atomic bomb survivor from Hiroshima. He was born here, but sent to Hiroshima and came back. He couldn't speak English that well, and it was an occupation in which you didn't need to speak English that well. In terms of the Pasadena connection, all these photos were taken in Pasadena. I love the photo of Ted Kobayashi in the 1920s. He's trying to look all fancy by putting the plant on the runner. And the other photos of Mac Yamaguchi, so he was from rural Northern California, was incarcerated, and then came to Pasadena and became a maintenance gardener. And yeah, he got his pickup truck from Evergreen Hostel that was in Boyle Heights. Another part of Pasadena history, you could find this map. I know it's hard for you to see, but there's just Google preserving Japantowns and then Pasadena. This was a project in which volunteers like myself, we did a windshield survey in which they produced a map based on the Sanborn insurance information, as well as directories from newspapers like the Rafushimpo, to identify Japanese businesses in different areas of California. This is of Pasadena. As you can see with a lot of the dots, there's a lot of dots of Japanese American businesses in old Pasadena. One thing, of course, why were there gardeners in Pasadena? It was a wealthy community, so you're going to have, as well as Japanese American domestics, you're going to have florists, nurseries to do all the plants, as well as laundries, right, to wash the sheets for all the fancy hotels. One thing that was really interesting to me personally was on the map is a dot for the Rafushimpo, the newspaper I had worked for, and it was basically someone's home. They were like, the satellite office. They probably contributed columns and as well as helped in distribution of the paper before World War II. And myself and my windshield survey partner, we were taking photos, and this African-American older man came out, very suspicious, like, why were we taking photos in his neighborhood? And we explained what we were doing, and it turned out he had delivered the Rafushimpo newspaper before World War II, and he also kind of had a crush on a Nisei girl on his street. So kind of the intersectionality of Pasadena. Another interesting fact, I live in the South Lake part of Pasadena, so very close to here. For those from the area, if you continue north on Lake, there's a Ralph's, a pretty big Ralph's. That used to be a very big Japanese American produce market with multiple stalls led by Japanese American families. So I couldn't help but to think, what if the forced removal didn't happen? This is from 1940. Maybe Pasadena, the presence of Japanese would Americans would be even more dominant or be more present than today. So another layer of Pasadena that I learned was contributing an article for this publication to celebrate the Huntington Japanese Garden Centennial. And that was a very long introduction to my topic, which was Torii Gate, Welcoming Empire, Japanese Immigrant and Nisei Cultural Workers, and Pasadena Landscape and Life. So this photo on the right-hand side is one of two Torii gates that used to be here at the Huntington, and they were created by this man, Toichiro Kawai. Toichiro Kawai came to America. He took one survey trip and then he came again in 1902. On this immigration document, he was on the U.S. Gaelic. It says that his contact is a Vincent March. It's actually Marsh, and that he was going to be a servant. It turns out he was much more than that. And he came here in 1902 at the age of 40, which is pretty old, right? And here on the right-hand side is a photo of the Nippon Nursery, which was one of the first Japanese-American nurseries in Pasadena on Orange Grove. And Toichiro is seated on the front row to the left, and he's holding a hat. And he's kind of handsome. He's kind of a handsome dude. This is Toichiro later, and his wife and oldest daughter they were in Japan. He was able to get them over here, and he's then later had all these kids, and there's one other on their way. So I think Toichiro and his wife Hama, they really tried to increase the Japanese American population here in Pasadena. When I was doing this article for the Huntington, Michelle Bailey, who works here, I don't know if she's here today, she showed me this photo, and I think she was just looking, at the tags, and this is of the Rose Bowl, right? And it just looks like, okay, there's some kind of event. The Rose Bowl was built in 1922. And, but let's take a closer look. Okay, you see the American flag? What's underneath the American flag? It's Mount Fuji. And then look, I don't know if this laser works. Okay, what's that? It's a Torii Gate. Now, what the heck is going on here? This actually was the Pasadena High School graduation. In 1927, I was baffled when I saw these write-ups in the Pasadena Star-News, because why was this happening at this time? I understand at the early 1900s, there was all this interest in Japanese art. Japan had, because Commodore Perry had forced the opening in the late 1800s, there's all this fascination with Japan. But this is a time, I've also done books on Terminal Island and the fishing community, as well as done research on agriculture, is like there was so much harsh anti-Japanese laws, restrictions, but here they're having like a Japanese-themed graduation, and they even had Nisei and kimono. It was like very interesting. Oh, and then that Torii was created by Toichiro Kawai, and this article says that a Hollywood director wanting to buy it, maybe for a movie. I have no idea what happened to it. Okay, so I'm going back a little further. I'm going to go quickly. And remember Victor Marsh. This is the person that brought Toichiro Kawai here. So he had a Japanese art store right across from Hotel Green, Castle Green, right across the way. And then, who is Victor Marsh? Well, he actually is overshadowed by his more famous brother, George Turner Marsh, who had, so the Marshes are Australians. George had spent a lot of time in Japan, learned the language, started working for trade companies, and then came to San Francisco to start his own Asian kind of arts business in the late 1800s. This is his store on Market Street in San Francisco in the late 1800s. And then this is the seminal thing that occurred was in 1893 was the Chicago's World's Fair with its Japanese house. Green and Green, one of the Greens, the architecture partners went over there and saw the house. Frank Lloyd Wright saw the house as a little boy. So this was an introduction to a Japanese aesthetic that perhaps made a lasting impact on these American architects. The following year, in 1894, San Francisco had its own exposition. Now, that Chicago fair, the Japanese government had funded that section of the fair. They didn't want to put more money into something in San Francisco, plus the Sino-Japanese War was coming up, so they didn't want to get involved. So as a result, George Turner Marsh, being the enterprising businessman that he was, he decided to create this Japanese village. And it was going to even have rickshaws that were powered by Japanese people. The local Japanese community, they were incensed. So was the Japanese government. And this is where the empire comes in. Because in 1993, the Japanese, they were trying to assert themselves. We are empire, we're a power to be respected, look at our arts. And then in 1994, a white man is creating this. And they felt like, oh, this is dehumanizing, as well as maybe lowering their power. So eventually, I think what happened is they used Germans, like in yellow or blackface, as they pulled the rickshaws. But to me, this was fascinating because here is Japan as a power, and then this white arts dealer who's interested in this, for various reasons, including commercial reasons. So who's in the middle of this? The Japanese immigrant artist. This is Toshio Aoki, and he worked for J.T. Marsh. He had quite a following among many white collectors. He was a showman. He was a street peddler. He had no shame. He was not necessarily loved by people in Japan. And he had designed the village for the San Francisco Fair. But he also painted and did amazing things. Oops. And one of the paintings is here at the Huntington, and I got a chance to see it in person. Isn't this amazing? It's not traditional, right, Japanese. This actually reminded me of things like we see today, like in manga or anime. He did a series of goddess paintings, and this is one of them. And there's kind of like a goth dark part to it, too. So this was Toshio. Toshio also he moved down to Pasadena, and he had these parties. He had a 1903 cherry blossom party. He invited 75 people, including J. Piermont Morgan, J.P. Morgan Chase. I banked with them, as well as a lot of people. And this was written up in the Good Housekeeping magazine. So really interesting. One person who was at the dinner was this young woman that he adopted, Tsuru Aoki. Do you all know who she is? She was one of the first silent screen stars, and she encouraged this man, Sesue Hayakawa, to be a screen star too. So that's an aside, really interesting. So in 1903, the story of the Marsh brothers J.T. Marsh decides he wants to create a Japanese garden in Old Pasadena. He does so 3 blocks away from where his brother has his store. And this is what it looked like. This is the Fujios, who were the caretakers of the garden. But new caretakers came in when they left for Japan, and these are the Gotos. Tsune is the woman, and Chiyozo is the husband. They had first two boys. She's here with Kametaro, or Tom, and soon to come is another son, Shige. And eventually this garden is moved to here. And I believe Kenny, the last son, was born, it says he was born in San Marino, so he was probably born here. Also with the move, again, Toichiro Kawai was the one who helped bring the building over here. He also built the bell tower and as well as this moon bridge. So what's the legacy of Toichiro Kawai? What was interesting, so he went, like all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, he was incarcerated. He was, like many Japanese American in Pasadena, was sent to Gila River concentration camp on an Indian reservation in Arizona. He died there. Actually, he was 81, not 82. It says that he had 10 kids, but he adopted a relative, and one daughter had died in childbirth. But yeah, and one of his sons was Nobu Kawai, a very patriotic man, and he argued for Niseis to be able to fight in World War II. So he was in direct opposition to like the draft resistors who said they didn't want to fight unless they were let go of camp. So kind of interesting. And then, he had, this is 1943, he already had 12 grandchildren. That's a lot. And so this is Leslie Kawai. This is one of his great-grandchildren, and she was in 1981, she was the first non-white Rose Queen. So totally appropriate. Another thing is Toichiro designed at least 3 rose floats in behalf of the Japanese community. And then in closing, just some personal connections to all I just presented. That's Stephanie Kawai, one of the other great-granddaughters. We went to Japan together, that's her husband, in 2012 to help with relief work after the earthquake and tsunami in Tohoku area. And the photo on the other side, Richard Goto. Richard Goto is son of the second son of Tsune and Chiyozo, and he was my Asian studies teacher at South Pasadena High School. But Richard told me, it was difficult for the boys to live in this weird, like, Japanese fantasy land when they just wanted to be an American. One of them, the older one, Tom, he got in trouble because he was throwing rocks at one of the lotus blossom, here at the Huntington, and so his father actually returned to Pasadena and was a gardener. So I think it was a more complicated relationship with being Japanese American in Pasadena. And the person on the bottom, remember that first photo I showed you of the Rafushimpo? This is from that. In the back row is Yukio Hayakawa, and this is actually the son of Sesshu Hayakawa. And he was not Tsuru's biological son. Sesshu had an affair with a white woman, and Yukio appeared. And, but Tsuru adopted him and raised him. And he's written about her and in very glowing terms. So for me, I'm really interested in Toshio Aoki. Like, the way he was perceived, he died around, I think, 1911, around there. But here, he had never returned back to Japan. And he's an immigrant and I'm not, but just in terms of our work, these are the covers of my books. So one is in English, and one was published in the US, another translation in France, but the rising sun, right? So that was placed there because those readers would immediately look at that and think Japan. So kind of like being a cultural producer, when we're out there, what sort of things that we're dealing with in terms of our audience. And to the right are 2 books that were published in Japan, and people also in Japan trying to figure out, well, who is this Naomi Hirahara or Hirahara Naomi? Is she a gaijin, a foreigner? We don't know what to do with her. So this is the end. So yeah, all of this, I'm working on a new mystery, and it's called Crown City, because that's the old name for Pasadena, and we'll see what happens. So thank you very much.
Hi, I don't have any visuals, so just get me. It's very dark out there. Okay, so I'm Jean Chen Ho. I'm gonna just dive into it. Mike Davis once said, remembering quote unquote bad history, as well as commemorating those who resisted it, should be a priority in civic art as well as primary education. As examples of such cases, Davis cited the 1928 Mulholland flood, a catastrophic failure of the St. Francis Dam that killed over 400 people, the Santa Anita racetrack, one of the public centers where Japanese Americans in Los Angeles were held in detention before they were transferred into concentration camps during World War II, and the site of the Black Panther Party's Southern California headquarters on Central Avenue and 4th Street, which was raided and destroyed by the LAPD in a 4-hour attack in 1969. To these, I would add the 1871 Los Angeles Chinatown massacre. So because this is a symposium on Asian American history in California, I'm going to assume that most in the room have at least some passing familiarity with this incident of racialized violence. You may also have heard that the city of LA is actually in the process of creating a public memorial to this case of bad history. Last year in August 2022, the city of LA issued a call for conceptual ideas from individuals, firms, groups of artists, designers, etc., for a world-class new memorial to the victims of the 1871 Chinese massacre. So the story of the massacre presented in the city's request for ideas follows a familiar plot, one that I've encountered over and over again in my research. So in the RFI, the language goes like this. In the late afternoon of October 24th, 1871, a gunfight broke out between 2 Chinese men on Calle de los Negros. This is the name of the alley, which has now been renamed to Los Angeles Street. It's a holdover from the Spanish colonial era and the Mexican era here in Los Angeles. So the story then unfolds this way. It's a shootout in the Chinese Quarter between 2 men from rival tongs, Yo Hing and Sam Yuen. They're feuding over a young woman named Yat Ho, followed by the incidental death of a white rancher who was caught in their crossfire. A vigilante mob gathered to exact revenge for the slain Anglo man, and then they murdered an unconfirmed number of Chinese residents, somewhere between 18 and 25 men and boys. The mob also raided a number of Chinese businesses for goods and cash and destroyed property by fire. Newspaper and courthouse accounts by the city's elite often demonized LA's, quote, ruffian and disreputable, end quote, class for for the massacre, but what combined these two social sets on the night of October 24th, 1871, was white vigilantism, the extra-legal device that enabled the massacre. Chinese settlers in the 19th century participated in vigorous social contests regarding space, labor, and legal status all along the West Coast, and in Los Angeles in particular, they did so within a uniquely multiracial, polyglot landscape with a history of indigenous, Mexican, European, African, and other intercultural residents. In the Reconstruction era, after the Civil War had divided the nation on the abolition of a race-based system of chattel slavery, the city of Los Angeles was engaging in its own particular contestation of a historically specific racial formation. So now I must confess, I'm not a historian by training. I'm a literature scholar and a novelist. So what strikes me about the narrative we tell and readily accept about the LA Chinatown massacre is the way that it begins with the possibility of death. Two Chinese men from rival associations, their pistols pointed at one another, and by its end, that possibility becomes a promise fulfilled, multiplied in lurid scale. Fiction writers know that each scene in a story must necessarily escalate tension to hold the reader's interest. In effect, to frame the Chinatown massacre story this way seems to create a telos in which the deaths by mob violence actually lead directly back to the two Chinese gunslingers rather than the vigilantes. This manner of narrating the 1871 massacre inadvertently places blame on the Chinese community for the very violence they suffered. In a companion to Los Angeles, historian Victor Ju argues that the focus on the Chinese as a source of unruly, violent conflict is then a stereotype subsequently used by anti-Chinese workers' unions, leading to more violence, expulsions, and restrictive, racialized legislature at the state and ultimately federal level with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was renewed in 1892 by the Gary Act and made permanent in 1902. At the Huntington, where I was doing my research, I wanted to explore what other possible stories could be told about the 1871 massacre besides the one we've so readily accepted. I accessed a number of manuscripts and rare books, family papers, correspondences, photos, in the library's California History Collection. These materials depicted early life in Los Angeles, or life in early Los Angeles, and I requested every source that might have anything to do with the men, women, and children who formed Old Chinatown in the second half of the 19th century. From the outset, I'd anticipated that the archival remnants surrounding the Chinatown massacre would be mostly from people, if not entirely all, who were not Chinese. So historians diverge on the lynch mob numbers. Some place it at 500. Others assert that upwards of 5,000 rioters participated in the massacre, which would mean that nearly the city's entire population was out in the streets that night. It's impossible to know for certain. As I said, I'm not a historian. Though one source of the latter, grander estimate belongs to Robert McClay Whitney, a white man who was there on the night of. So Whitney was a member of the elite class in Los Angeles in the late 1800s. He was a lawyer and real estate entrepreneur and a transportation lobbyist. He formed LA's first chamber of commerce and had a hand in establishing the Southern Pacific Railroad in the city. He's also the founder of University of Southern California, the state's oldest private research university and my home institution. I just defended my dissertation a month ago. Thank you. So Whitney's papers are archived here at the Huntington Library. His handwritten memoirs of the LA Chinatown massacre are just one small item among the many photographs, personal and business correspondences, family journals, and other remnants of his life that are preserved here. So in 1871, Whitney was 33 years old. His memoirs of that night, however, were written in 1921 when he was 83. His account of the massacre is written in soft black pencil, paragraphs of tilted cursive on pages of faded yellow legal paper, because he was a lawyer. and they're brown at the edges. There are 7 paragraphs of preamble before Whitney begins to narrate the events of that fateful night. Quote, "Many accounts of this affair have appeared in print at different times," he states, "mostly written by persons who were not present and who obtained very fragmentary and incorrect information from various sources. The writer was present during most of the occurrences from about 6 p.m. until the termination about 11 p.m. and was very actively engaged in rescuing Chinese from the rioters," end quote. So reading this in the archives, I noted that the writer wanted to quickly establish his role within this affair as someone who was very actively engaged in rescuing Chinese. The rhetorical framing gave me pause. It seemed that 50 years after the incident, Whitney was still determined first and foremost in establishing his innocence. Not only innocence, but in fact his heroism, though undoubtedly told with the utmost genteel humility in the narrative. So he goes on to write, "I have frequently been asked to give an account of what I did and saw, but owing to the fact that I was so conspicuously engaged in bringing the riot to a termination that it would seem very egotistical for me to fully write just what I did, and for that reason, I have always declined." He goes on to say that when the rioting began, he quickly dispatched members of the Law and Order Party, which he calls a volunteer citizens committee, to deter the lynch mob. Their, quote, "valiant efforts saved a number of Chinese men and women who were being held hostage by vigilantes," Whitney wrote, "by diverting the innocent into the city jail yard." Whitney's recollection ends with the highest praise for the brave men in the Vigilance Committee who rode with him on the night of October 24th for, quote, "cool, fearless action," end quote, and their selfless efforts to halt the riot. And then this is a direct quote, "Not one of them showed the least nervousness, excitement, or haste. Each one seemed as indifferent to danger as if he were transacting an ordinary, everyday affair," he concludes. This narrative has been passed down through time. It's been reprinted in newspapers, regional interest almanacs, and history books, one of which I looked at in the Huntington archives, and it was like written by his son-in-law. So if you Google Robert McClay Whitney today, alongside his many considerable civic achievements, intervening on the side of peace during the 1871 Chinatown riot figures quite prominently. However, as Ken Gonzalez-Day theorizes in Notes from Lynching in the West, quote, "even the most ambitious researchers are challenged to distinguish substantial differences between the practices referred as vigilance committees, lynch mobs, kangaroo courts, hanging parties, and sheriff's posses," end quote. In short, Whitney's claim to have been very actively engaged in rescuing Chinese with the help of the members in the Law and Order Party exists within an aporia of unstable narratives about the role of citizens as self-appointed police. At the age of 83, perhaps Whitney wanted to cement his legacy as a gentleman and not one of those supposed working-class roughnecks who reveled in the spectacle of mob justice when the city's criminal and legal systems were still being forged. What's more, the prominence of this story in the archives supersedes the one about Whitney's role in the criminal investigation and the trials that followed. You see, the story doesn't end there. Months after the massacre, Whitney was called upon to preside over the trials of the 10 men indicted for inciting the mob violence. Under modern laws of recusal, a judge cannot hear a case if their impartiality of the circumstances might reasonably be questioned, and the fact that he was there that night would obviously color his view of the trial evidence. But this ethical standard didn't apply in the 19th century courts, and so he didn't remove himself from the appointment. And then another 19th century reality, of course, is that no Chinese witnesses were allowed to testify to the murders, following the same legal statutes that barred African Americans and Native Americans from giving evidence against whites in a court of law. Sadia Hartman writes, quote, "Every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters." If, for example, the courts had allowed legal testimony from members of the Chinese community, would a different picture of the night emerge? If history were told from their perspective, if the Chinese witnesses and survivors of the massacre were endowed with what Hartman calls the gravity and authority of the historical actor, rather than the passively acted upon, would the humble, ordinary citizen-turned-savior narrative that Whitney sought to claim by adding his final word on the matter near the end of his life still stand? In his memoirs, Whitney did not write about the criminal trial and sentencing. Of the 10 men put to trial, 8 were found guilty of manslaughter. At the time, the maximum penalty for manslaughter in California warranted 10 years. Judge Whitney meted out more lenient sentences, however, ranging from 2 to 6 years to each of the convicted men. And his memoirs certainly didn't address how the convictions were overturned in appeal a year later due to a semantic error in the original indictment that he, the presiding judge, should have caught and sealed. And Whitney himself signed the order releasing the men who were being held at San Quentin. And after this happened, he came under fire. A journalist, Horace Bell, condescended that Whitney was a mere real estate agent unfit for the gravity of the judge's bench. Still, Whitney's own account of the events remained ever present. In August 2014, then president of USC, Max Nikias, unveiled an 8-foot, 1,000-pound bronze statue of Robert McClay Whitney in front of the Alumni House on the South Quad of campus. Nikias' remarks for the celebratory occasion included an invocation of Whitney's heroism on the evening of October 24th, 1871. A part of his speech goes, in that moment, my fellow Trojans, the DNA of USC as a global institution first materialized. And he goes on to say, on that evening, the ethos, the character of USC began to take shape. So, returning to Mike Davis, who implored us to remember the city's bad history, as well as those historical figures who resisted it, the question arises, where do we place someone like Robert McClay Whitney, who had the power to narrate his own story and have its social and material integrity preserved through structures like that giant bronze statue erected on the USC campus and here in the Huntington Library archives? What about the distorted, destroyed, or otherwise absent narratives from the victims of the massacre, as well as those who survived that night of violence? So the work that I am taking up now is to reckon with the speculative possibilities of Asian American lives that had previously only seemed visible at the very moment they were suddenly extinguished by violence. Whether as a scholar of Asian American history, a writer of Asian American historical fiction, or somewhere in the interdisciplinary porous spaces therein, the next phase of my project, a speculative novel which includes the 1871 Chinatown massacre, now requires the intellectual and emotional capaciousness to imagine all that cannot be verified by the archive in order to tell a story about lives that exceed the archive and their sublime and impossible beauty. Thank you.
Present from my computer instead. I don't know if that's.
Give you the direction.
So, wow, that was amazing. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to be a little difficult, and because I actually revised my presentation as I was listening to Naomi's, so I'm asking if I can present from my computer, but we'll see if that's possible. If not, it's okay. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, so actually, that photograph that you just saw was taken at Toyo Miyatake's studio. So first of all, thank you all so much for having me here today. It's a real honor. Thank you to Wei Yang, Philip Bloom, Michelle Bailey, and especially Yunxi Lerman Tan. So today I'm going to be talking about, well, a couple of things. One is the Asian American Art Initiative at Stanford, which I think is actually quite connected to a lot of the questions that we've been discussing and that have been raised by my fellow speakers, but also about some of the narratives and the works of art in our first exhibition. So the Asian American Art Initiative at Stanford is an effort to collect and preserve histories of Asian American artists and works by Asian American artists. And so it's a joint effort between the Cantor Art Center as well as Stanford Libraries and Special Collections. And it really began actually in 2016 when I arrived at Stanford, right out of graduate school, actually. And the first class that I wanted to teach, that I knew I wanted to teach at Stanford, is the class that I always wanted as both an undergraduate and a graduate student, but was never offered, History of Asian American Art. I'm from Southern California. I'm from Irvine. There's always one person in an audience that went to my high school, University High School, whenever I give a presentation like this. So I'd be curious. So if you're here, introduce yourself to me afterwards. But growing up in Southern California, I knew that there were all of these histories that were not being told in my art historical education at NYU. And in fact, when I got to Stanford and was trying to put together this class, I started looking for other syllabi. And so I did actually, I looked at the courses going back for several years of, I think close to 25 universities. And I wasn't seeing exactly, this history being taught. And so I really, was challenged to put together this first class. But I was very lucky in that, two things. One is that Professor Gordon Chang, who you heard from earlier, had actually published a textbook with a couple of other scholars in 2008, Asian American Art History, which is the first and I believe only textbook of Asian American art history. So I had a base to work with, as well as all of the files, the research files for this book were at Stanford Special Collections, and I was also very lucky that a grad student who was past coursework, who had actually previously worked with another speaker, Jeff Chang, Yunxi Lerman Tan, was a graduate student in the department. You might know that she is now curator of American art here at the Huntington, but she was my first TA and really worked with me to shape this initial survey course. What you're looking at on the right is a photograph at top you might be familiar with. It's a photograph by Dorothea Lange taken in 1942 in Oakland, California, of a Japanese-owned grocery store that, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the proprietors erected a sign claiming, "I am an American," in order to try to forestall, some of the violence that they knew was coming. And then what you see at bottom is the contemporary artist Stephanie Sujuko, she's Filipino-American, transformed this sign, I think very smartly reversed the colors of the text into a fabric banner that you then see hanging in the lobby of the Cantor Arts Center. No longer a kind of assertive declaration, but with the ripples of the fabric, the fact that it does move on its installation scaffolding, it is something you can walk around around and actually question, and that is kind of semi-legible because it is kind of bunched up like a curtain. And the reason why I'm showing you these images is because, of course, in fall 2016 was the election of Donald Trump. And I just remember coming into to the class, the day after with Yinshi, and, the students were in tears, and we were, all kind of processing. And it was also a moment, right after we had just learned about the history of Japanese incarceration and Executive Order 9066, and the kind of forced removal and incarceration of 120,000 people of Japanese descent on the Western Seaboard, and all of a sudden, this history became vivid, especially as, and so newly palpable, especially as, more executive orders banning certain kinds of immigrants into this country were passed, and so, this is really the impetus for kind of thinking about Stanford as a place that could really, preserve some of the histories of Asian American art and artists, particularly at this moment. And as Gordon Chang has already shown us the photograph on the left of actually titled in a magazine, East and West, shaking hands, which I think is quite striking, and documented the kind of the constructed nature of this history and the way photographs themselves construct kind of memories of what historical events become, who was there and who wasn't there, which of course has been also discussed in several talks today. But the Cantor Art, Stanford is enmeshed in this history, just on a very material level. Of course, Leland Stanford was president of the Central Pacific Railroad Company that built the kind of western side, and the fortune was largely built from this employment, and so, which Gordon has written about as well. And so really Stanford University is built and materially tied to this history, and that is evident in the collections of the museums themselves, right? Which actually hold the golden spike, the ceremonial golden spike, which itself is engraved with the names of the engineers of the Transcontinental Railroad, so none of course, the laborers. And it also holds the silver shovel that was kind of ceremonially used in the kind of fictional or, the performed ceremony, the laying of the last rail, which I was actually delighted to see being held by Leland Stanford in the painting that, the Thomas Hill painting that Gordon showed. And moreover, in fact, kind of recent work by Stanford archaeologists has uncovered that the palm trees on Palm Drive were planted by Chinese laborers. Lake Lagunitas, which is a kind of beloved, landmark on the Stanford campus, was dug by Chinese laborers. Chinese gardeners actually tended Stanford's lands. And so, it makes also sense to think about Asian American art at Stanford as a continuation of and an acknowledgement of this history, which is so often not discussed, right? And so, the question of what it means to collect Asian American art is quite a complex one. I was really struck by, the introductory remarks about, the capaciousness of the term Asian American, but also the way it holds so many different and distinctive immigration and migration and refugee, status narratives. And, the one thing I say to my students and when I'm giving talks like this about what it means for a place like the Cantor Art Center to collect something called Asian American art, is that, I really believe that works of art are embodied with specificities of history, right, and lived experiences. And so in collecting all of these works of Asian American art, we're not trying to homogenize them into a single category, but I believe that like a kind of close, intensive looking and studying of these works of art will show, in fact, just the infinite number of specific experiences, not only of kind of migration and exile, but also of gender, sexuality, class, that inhere within this kind of category, Asian American. And so since May, this number has increased, but before 2018, there were only 33 works of art by AAPI artists in the collection, which I think speaks to kind of larger institutional lack of care and lack of concern for these artists, right? And then, since then, we have increased the collection quite a bit. And in recently, this fall, we had our kind of first launch where we were finally able to show what we've been working on, since 2016. I co-direct the initiative with the curator at the Cantor Arts Center, Elisa Peachmar and Alexander. So there were 3 exhibitions, including one curated by Elisa, East of the Pacific, which I'll spend the remainder of my time today discussing. But East of the Pacific, just the title is a provocation and a question of orientation. What happens if we think about, the Americas not as the West, but as actually east of Asia, right? And so it's a question of asking us to just see differently and reorient ourselves and what these works of art can do for that history. This was one of the opening galleries, which includes a work by George Matsuboro Hebe, The Three Muses, on the opening wall. And this, Hebe is an artist who was born in 1886. He came to the United States in 1906. And the Three Muses painting, which, as you can see from the installation view, is quite large, is this really striking painting of 3 nude women, allegorical figures. The Muses in Greek mythology are, represent the literature and the arts and are often shown with the accoutrements of their kind of allegorical art, a lyre or a pen, a book. But here they're shown intertwined without any of those accessories, and also intertwined with a landscape that looks kind of distinctly Northern Californian. Perhaps, actually there are like gardeners in the audience, you can tell me, but perhaps cypresses or redwoods. And then of course you have the kind of general ethnic ambiguity of these figures who have black hair. And so there's this question of, and of this merging of various kind of strands, the Northern California landscape, a kind of Western mythological history, and Hebe's own kind of life, and perhaps the potentially Asian racialization of these women, all adhering in a single painting. And this speaks to the fact that Hebe himself was the founder of a society called the East-West Society, which was an artist society that had artists of East Asian, Chinese, Japanese, as well as Russian, white descent. And Hebe, and this society was really geared toward, founded in 1921, was geared towards trying to break down the barriers among these different groups. And so you can see that kind of desire inhering in a painting like this, which is mixing so many different sources, right, into a single composition. And then on the right, what you see is a painting, Monterey Cove, by the artist Uyama, who was born in 1889 and immigrated to the the United States from Japan at the age of 19 to attend art school. He actually went to USC, as well as the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and made this gorgeous kind of painting with these deep blues of Monterey Cove. It's a little distorted on the screen, sorry. Gordon Chang actually told me that this painting was one that he considered putting on the cover of the Asian American art book. And my time is going much faster than I thought. But these are images, and Uyama was also part of an artist collective, a salon based out of Little Tokyo called Shakudo, which was Shakudosha, excuse me, which was included members, including Torii Miyatake, as well as Henry Sugimoto, the cinematographer James Wong Ho, and the choreographer Michio Ito. And they invited artists such as Edward Weston and Diego Rivera, were kind of in conversation with these artists in Little Tokyo in the 20s and 30s. And both of these objects, I think, kind of tell a strong history, not only of kind of Japanese American experience in the early 20th century, but also the kind of history of art and how fragile it can be. Hebe's paintings, actually, when he knew he was about to be incarcerated, he gave close to 40 canvases to the city of Hayward for safekeeping, and they were subsequently lost. A majority of Uyama's oeuvre was actually destroyed in a fire and an earthquake in 1936. And so the Cantor is quite lucky to have these examples. And both men were incarcerated and established art schools in the camps. In fact, the art schools were enormous centers of the incarceration camps were enormous centers of arts education because there were so many artists who were incarcerated and formed art schools there. And then when Uyama came out, he established the still extant which many of you probably know, gift shop in Little Tokyo, Bunkado, which you can see an installation from at the bottom right. And so this is just to say that these works of art help us trace people's lives before and after kind of cataclysmic events such as the Japanese incarceration. And then I couldn't help, as Naomi was speaking, to describe, to put up actually the fact that we have a very early work by Aoki. It was on view in East of the Pacific. It's from 1895. And these are Hayashi persimmons in a Native American basket. So again, thinking about the kinds of, the way art, kind of synthesizes different strands that are thought to be separate into single objects. And on the right, Naomi, you should come to the Cantor. You can see we have several works by Aoki in the collection. I just wanted to show you, this is the stuff I pulled from from actually one of my lesson plans when I was hearing her speak. Aoki's practice also kind of synthesizing different sources, so kind of history of kamis, kind of spirits. Here, hope shown as a woman, an allegorical figure, also raising a lantern, very clearly a call out to the Statue of Liberty. And look at how early these are. And then to your point about manga, this is how I teach Aoki. I'm like, this is where Pokemon comes from. There's a history of kind of demons and spirits in Japanese art that Aoki is certainly drawing off of. And so I was like, art history is relevant to your lives too. And so I'm almost out of time, but just very quickly, I wanted to show you some other things that are in the collection. The East-West Society is just one section of East of the Pacific. Here we have a section on Chinatown with this remarkable painting by Martin Wong, which as an art historian I know is a callback to Arnold Genthy's kind of orientalizing and ethnographic photographs of the neighborhood. But then when I was looking at these paintings with a community historian of San Francisco Chinatown, he's like, oh, I know that dragon. He's like, that's in the Empress of China building in San Francisco Chinatown. And so, I bring this up because it's an opportunity to say that one of the things that I've learned working on Asian American art is that, like, I am not the expert, the community is the expert. And it's really helped me rethink, the ways that universities value certain forms, and art museums value certain forms of knowledge, and certain sources of knowledge, accredited knowledge, but in fact, the histories, the real experts are in the communities, and so it really has challenged me to practice art history in a very different way. Just some other sections. There was a section on incarceration that is actually talking about the camps as an arts education space. We actually were donated, so many of the works were donated by families. We're donated, paintings by the high school student, Amiko Nakano, who became like a really amazing abstract expressionist artist. Just to show you, in fact, that a bulk of the collection came from a purchase from a collector, and they were stored actually in a storage locker. And so that's something else that we're really thinking about is, the way that I think justifiably there's in the last talk there was some kind of suspicion of archives and institutions as repositories of official history. And so that's something we've been thinking about a lot, but also just thinking about what archives and museums can do in terms of preserving these works of art, especially when these physical objects were not in temperature control. So most of the money we've put into these objects have been through conservation, actually, to try to get them, to preserve them for future scholars and students to do what they want. But, I just wanted to end with this painting, which is actually by Timi Akage, who's the first artist of Japanese descent in the United States. It's like this amazing little small painting of these quails. They're quite anthropomorphic. They've got these bright gleams in their eyes. But the thing you'll notice is the sky. The sky is quite flat in relation to the rest of the painting, and that's because of a poor restoration that was done on the work. In restoration practices today, the main thing that you ask for is that it be reversible, right? But this is not reversible. So in a lot of other museums, this is a work that would not have been deemed fit for exhibition, but it was shown in East of the Pacific because of the historical significance, but also because, that history of that sky, I think, speaks a lot to the ways in which, this history has been altered, laid over, not cared for by institutions, not given the same regard as other canonical works of art. But to show you what the kids are doing these days, so I taught this in my Asian American art class. I talked about the sky, and then for the final project, I had a computer scientist in the class who was like, okay, let me try to use AI. So he turned in this amazing final project where he was like, what if we made the sky like Starry Night? But you see it alters the head of the quail also, which is really interesting. And then the last thing he did was he found an extant Kagi painting and actually used AI to overwrite the sky. And this is not to say like this is the future of art history, but although maybe it is. But one of the things to say that I really care about here is that the students are approaching this history, these objects, as things themselves, as their history, and as their history to remix, transform, and imagine differently as they will. Okay, thank you.
I want to take the time to thank all of our presenters today for sharing your wonderful talks and for sharing your expertise with us today. I have prepared. So I had actually prepared more than 20 questions as part of the moderated conversation, but we're already out of time, and apparently. So I think I'm just going to jump into a Q&A session so that you will at least get some time, get your questions in. In my experience in this room, that if you project your voice, sound tend to travel pretty well, so we should all be able to hear you. But if you do need the microphone, please raise your hands, and one of our colleagues will hand you a microphone if you need it. So I see a hand in the front.
First question is for Dr. Chen. I assume there should be some photo on the east-west connection, the railroad. Are we able to find any photo with Chinese railroad workers so far?
Thank you for the question. The question was, are there any photos that show Chinese at the east-west moment? Is that? Yes. Well, I didn't have time, but I would have lingered on that photo. And as some of you who had attended my earlier talk might remember, I point out that there is a Chinese in that photo. So I left it as a question, where is the Chinese, if you remember? So most people don't see him, these are all guys, but he's actually toward the front, with his back toward the camera, everybody else is facing the camera, and he's in tattered work clothes. You can see the patches, and the dress is work dress, and you can see other photos that have the same type of dress and hat, and he's moving. So he's blurry, and as I say, ghost-like. So that's one of the reasons my book is called Ghosts of Gold Mountain. And there are other photos we have of Chinese on the railroad line where they're moving because either they're not interested, they're scared, or they just are shy, whatever the reason. In a lot of photos, the Chinese don't want to be photographed. So they are ghostly. Now, also in that photo, which is by A.J. Russell, famous Western photographer. In the uncropped photo, there appears to be a Chinese way at the top left-hand corner standing, but in most copies of the photo, he's cut out of it. There are other photos that he took which show the Chinese clearly in the center, and I have a whole lecture just on the photos, where the photos depict the Chinese laying the track in the center, and he entitles them Chinese laying the last rails. But the photo that has become famous, as we've talked about narratives and why certain are privileged, that one is the privileged one.
A second question related to the first one is give me an estimate, okay, between the amount of work completed by Chinese versus by, I will say, non-Chinese. Just a guess.
Well, the tunnels, both in the High Sierra, the Donner Summit, also down here in Stanford down the tunnel, were all Chinese workers, 90%. And the foreman might have been white, but the Chinese did the actual work. So with a chisel and hammer, because in the High Sierra it's granite, they could make about 1 inch of progress a day. The last little bit of information, because I teased you with how do you construct a tunnel on 8 faces at the same time. And that's because they build shafts down from the top of the mountain into the depth of the mountain and then tunneled out in different directions. So they had different crews working at multiple sites at the same time, stuck inside the guts of the tunnel.
I see a hand in the back. Yes.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say that you posed the question, what happened after all the Chinese after the railroads were finished. Obviously, the age of railroad building wasn't over, but so many came to Southern California and moved right into the vineyard industry, because LA used to be the greatest producer of wine in the country. And there's a lot of photos of, especially in Altadena and Sierra Madre, of vineyard workers who even B.D. Wilson compared these workers favorably to the best agricultural workers of Northern Europe, because it's very, takes a lot of expertise to work in vineyards. So I just wanted to add that.
I see a hand in the bag.
Thank you. Great panel, first of all. I had a question for Naomi, which is, I was really intrigued by your point about imagining what the Pasadena Nikkei community would have been like if not for relocation and incarceration. What do we know about the demographics of that community pre-war, and how did it compare with other Nikkei neighborhoods around the Los Angeles area?
That's a great question. I don't have those numbers at the, right now, but I think what was interesting about the Pasadena population is other areas were more agricultural based, and this was more service oriented. So that I think made it kind of unique. But as a result of that, in more farming communities, you're going to have more people, right? More people working on the farm. So in that sense, maybe with the straight numbers, it wasn't as significant as other places. But I think as a result of that, Pasadena has been kind of ignored. Of course, I'm a Pasadena person, so I'm going to say this. But I think there's interesting elements of it as a community that we should take a second look at.
Yes.
Hi. All four of you in your work are basically filling in narratives. Okay, sure. Are basically filling in narratives of historical aspects of our ancestors' experiences in this country. And what value do you feel like in each of your specific lines of work that you are hoping for people to take away from being able to fill in these gaps in history? What value can we take ourselves, and what are you hoping to accomplish, and what are you hoping that younger people will take away from your work?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that there are so many different answers that I have, but just two things come to mind. It's that one that every single work of art for me by an artist, I just think it's like miraculous that they made it, that it survives. I'm just like, we talked about all of, in this particular panel, we talked about all of the structures that align to constrict, the violence that people face, the discrimination, both overt and covert, and I'm just like, people made things like that. That to me is like miraculous. They made things in the camps, in the incarceration camps. And that's one thing. I was just like, people have survived and they made things. And then I guess the other thing that I tell my students is I'm like, there are many ways to be in the world. All of these artists found different ways of surviving, of making things, of, balancing, a need to make money, to survive, to make a living, to support their families. And we're also making things. So many of the artists that I talked about, like, have jobs other than being artists, right? And that there's all sorts of kind of reasons for that in terms of the way their work has or has not been valued. But I think that so many of my students are facing these questions about this very dire economic reality that they're going into, and the jobs that they feel like they have to take. And I'm just like, you can do there. Like, here are examples. Here are other people who found their own way through not identical but parallel questions and challenges.
I love that answer. I don't know, I think that for me, because I'm a novelist, I'm interested in feeling, right? And you said that people made things despite being, having all sorts of other jobs. And Gordon, you gave such a wonderful talk about the Chinese as laborers, and so much of our history is centered on the economic aspects or the labor aspects. And even amongst those thousands of Chinese railroad workers, I wonder how many of them were poets or artists too. So in my work, I think I use these historical archives as a jumping off point to try to generate a sense of humanity and beauty and feeling.
Thank you all so much today.
Just a quick response. So as a historian, we're usually taught as a professional historian to be neutral, to talk about the stories. But in truth, all history as given is positional. It's all, and as discussed, written histories, whatever they are, in the past have been from a certain standpoint. And to a certain extent, you can say, yes, what we're doing is filling in, but we're also trying repositioning. And the importance for that today is for audiences, for all Americans to understand the complexity of American history, and that it's not told just from one viewpoint, or certainly from an elite viewpoint, from the photos and the paintings that I showed, is from one position. But if you flip it, and how does history look, how does history look from a different position? And that's what I think is very important for us to embrace today in the midst of anti-Asian violence. So as a historian, I'm asked to talk about the history of anti-Asian violence. And part of the message is, I'm trying to get across to other audiences, is that Asian Americans have been part of American history, embedded in American history. So they're not alien, they're not foreign, they're not marginal, but right in the middle of the American experience.
Growing up, I was embarrassed that my dad was a gardener when we moved to South Pasadena. And I think a lot of my husband goes, just because you said some derogatory things about your dad when you were young, you had to make him the hero of your 7-book series. And I guess part of it is, yes, to give people a name and life, feelings.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you so much. So we are at a time to break for lunch. If you have prepaid for your lunch, our buffet will be serving out in the Rose Hill Garden Courts, just right outside. If you did not prepay for lunch, we have several dining options around the campus. 1919 Cafe, Red Car, also the Chinese Garden. And if you have a name tag, you're welcome to go into the gardens as well during the lunch hours to look around, to go to lunch in the Chinese Garden, and just enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much.